But I was curious about, how did readers actually use this book? How did they actually mediate it and apply it to their own scholarship?
You are listening to And If Love Remains, a unique show spotlighting people, ideas, science, culture, and art. Your host,
Mike Lovett.
You are indeed listening to And If Love Remains. I am your sometimes occasionally vile, but always virile host, Mike Levitt, the blind Rabbi Micah himself. Glad to be here. Glad to have you guys join us on this journey of craziness and joy and all those things that make this podcast great. So please like, subscribe, make it viral, do that thing you do. And I'm so pumped to have Dr. James Russell back in
Great to be
studio. Here. Yes, it's so good. Just a quick background on Dr. Russell. He is a book historian here in Phoenix. He completed his doctorate at the Institute of Medieval and Early Modern Studies at Durham University in the UK. James is interested in how material texts shape spiritual experiences, focusing on early modern esoteric contemplative literature. He studies the traces readers have left behind in books and manuscripts in order to reconstruct the reading experiences of the past. I mean, that's like a meta reason of way of reading stuff. Like, I'm not just going to read the text. I'm going to read the things that people thought about reading, wrote the thing, and then I'm going to think about what that meant about what they were thinking about what they were reading about the text.
Certainly, yeah. It's the history of the experience of reading. Reader reception studies is the framework in which I put this project. I'm interested in taking literature and foregrounding the agency of readers. Thinking about literature not as just this detached object or looking at books as solely an artifact, but the way they shape the experiences of living people.
You know, and I think the subject that we're going to talk about today probably exemplifies that more than just about any, even in some ways, even more than the Bible, which is hard to say because I think the Bible kind of is so ingrained in us. But this particular text is so bizarre and cool and interesting. And we're going to talk about that. And the text we're going to talk about today is, I'm going to try it. This is
Go for it.
Part deux. I'm going to try. So
you can do this. I believe in you, Mike.
the Hypnerotomachia Poliphili. Polyphila.
You're almost all the way there. Very good. Yeah,
Someday I'll get my doctorate in pronunciation. All right, pronounce it for us.
Sure. It's the Hypnerotomachia Poliphili, which means the strife of love in a dream of he who loves many things. So let's break this title down to its Latin roots. Hypnos, sleep. Eros, romantic love. And machia, conflict or strife. Poliphili, you have poly meaning many, and phil meaning love. So it's been rendered as the strife of love in a dream of he who loves many things. And it is one of the most sumptuous, bizarre, intriguing books of the Renaissance. And it's why I chose to do my PhD on it.
Oh, that's great. And by the way, that title just doesn't just grab you. Come on, guys. Like, that title it speaks to romance, like in every way. Like, and I don't mean romantic just as like in a like a romance novel or something like that, but like romantic in the like almost in the Russian sense.
Yeah.
You know? like tied to the land, tied to like the lover of life, the lover of people, the lover of women, the lover of like that's what it kind of like, and we'll get into the text itself, but that's what the title itself kind of makes me think of.
It is. One of the scholars of the Hypnerotomachia, Peter Dronke, said it's one of the psychological heights of the genre of romance.
Wow.
And when you look at the book, it's both a combination of an encyclopedia and a love story, which are two genres that you don't immediately seem to fit together. But in merging them, you see that the passion that Renaissance scholars had for antiquity, that it went beyond just a detached intellectual curiosity. It was almost erotic, really, in the way, or in some ways even went into that. Their just complete love of antiquity, and you get a sense of what an exciting time it would have been and what it would be like to look over Renaissance scholars' shoulders as they're absorbing the Greek and Latin classics.
And you got to do that a little bit as you studied this and started and studied the marginalia, which is a term that I learned from our last podcast. Thank you, Dr. Russell.
Right on.
Because when you're studying that, you're again, like I talked about before, it's that meta idea of like you're reading into what is being read. Now that kind of makes me ask a question, like, how far as a modern, when I say modern in this context, a 2023 person, how far can we read into, or how much can we read into what they wrote down? In other words, how hard is it to remove our modern sensibilities from what they are writing?
It's difficult. But one thing you find in reading the marginalia, the notes that readers scribbled into the margins of this book, is that they often overlap with modern critics. So what I did was I took modern commentaries on the Hypnerotomachia and read them alongside the notes that Renaissance writers were putting in, and saw that they would often converge on the same point. So you get the sense in reading this that you're part of an intellectual tradition that goes back quite far. And I guess it's a fallacy to think that we can get into someone else's head, but this is one of the closest you can get to seeing the personal reading experiences. And that's the reason I chose to work on marginalia, is that in the humanities, I was a little disconcerted by the turn into sort of extreme postmodern theory, where it was so abstract and so detached from the actual text. I wanted to do something a little more empirical. I wanted to see, can I show...
So getting into somebody's head's more empirical?
Yeah. Yeah, very good. Yeah, that's a good point. Points well taken. Yeah, I want to see rather than speculating about authorial intent, see how did people actually read this book? Because the Hypnerotomachia has sort of become a symbol for the bizarre in Renaissance studies, and it's usually put on the shelf as just something to admire. But I was curious about, how did readers actually use this book? Mm-hmm. How did they actually mediate it and apply it to their own scholarship? And that's what turned me to the marginal notes.
That's awesome. I love that. That's just fantastic. One of the interesting and most peculiar things about this particular book, if I'm not mistaken, are the wood cuttings, as you say, the illustrations. First of all, they're beautiful, and we're going to add some pictures of them in the show notes and give some people some links so you can look at them. But I think, tell me if I'm right, they were more than just like trying to depict what was going on the page, like you might see in a children's book. Like there's more to it than that. Talk about the illustrations, what they were, and how they were used in the context of the text itself.
Well, the Hypnerotomachia is considered one of the most beautiful books of the Renaissance. It is prized by collectors and has usually attracted attention from the perspective of bibliographical connoisseurship. So people often approach the woodcuts and leave the text aside, treating it kind of like a lorem ipsum style filler. But the more time you spend with this book, you realize how elegantly text and image interplay with each other. And in it, not only how the woodcuts are with great typographical skill inserted into the flow of the text block, but also the way text is put into the woodcut. For example, the woodcuts include some selections in Arabic and in Hebrew, which instead of rendering it with a typeface, the Arabic and the Hebrew was actually carved directly into the woodcut. So this book is just a visual feast and an intellectual feast. And that's one of the things that drew me to it, because I'm very ADD. And this book is constant stimulation of the eye, the ear. It's an experience almost for all the senses. And then in the book, there's often vivid descriptions of scent and taste.
Wow.
Yeah.
So in some ways, like, I mean, I think it'd be, I don't think you could call it like compared to like a modern movie or something, but maybe the way you're describing it, it's almost like how poetry, the important things of poetry is not just the words themselves, but it's the sound, it's everything that surrounds those words, and how it is, how like I said, it's sound mixed with meaning, where like this almost is like picture mixed with meaning. It's the idea of like, okay, I'm supposed to use this as a tool to understand the text itself. Is that right, or am I overplaying my hand here?
No, certainly it integrates with the text. In fact, one copy takes a given scene in the book. The book is set in a dream within a dream, and one of the things that Freud argued is that the dream is the place where the word "no" does not apply. So the author takes advantage of the dream space to create impossible structures that couldn't be constructed in reality. There's one woodcut, which we can put an image of in the show notes, is of a pyramid that is unconstructably huge. But the author uses this pyramid as a device to illustrate every different architectural feature found in Vitruvius's De Architectura, on architecture. And one of the annotators in a copy of All Places in the Buffalo County Public Library used this illustration of a pyramid as a way of making essentially hyperlinks within the text. So he labeled different architectural features on the pyramid with where those architectural features later occur within the book. And you can use it like a DVD menu. Like, you know how, I know we're entering the age of streaming, but in a DVD menu, you often have an image. You can click on different parts of the image to be taken to scenes in the movie. And there's very much a hypertextual way of framing this book.
That's wild. That's just wonderful. And again, like, until we haven't even gotten into like what it's about, and it's crazy. Like you said, a dream within a dream. It's Inception.
It is Inception.
From the late 1400s. But I kind of want to still paint a picture for people. Like, talk about the medium itself. Like, the size. Like, how would people use it? How would people see it? How, like, what? It's kind of hard to, like, I'm still imagining, like, this couldn't have been a scroll, so it's definitely a folio of some sort. It is, right? It's
a folio size book.
And then and then how big is it? Like, talk about like the structure of the book itself, the physical structure.
It's a folio, so it's a book where the pages are folded once. It's a relatively large book. And so you get this experience that doesn't quite translate to the 1999 English translation done by Jocelyn Godwin on the 500th anniversary of the book. That you get the sense of it's large enough to fill your visual space, and it's large enough to give you lots of room to work with a pen on the margins. So one of my arguments is that this book is essentially a Renaissance activity book for intellectuals, that it contains games within the book that invites the readers to play with pen and ink.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
That is absolutely fantastic. It becomes this, like, the playful dialogue over centuries, as different scholars look at it and read it and compare, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Play is one of the themes that I foregrounded in approaching this book, that people in the Renaissance read this book in I use the term ludic engagement, which is basically they played with it. They would look at a word in this constructed language and try to piece it into its Latin or Greek roots. Or there are even times when the book says, here's how you can draw an image. Here are the instructions. And you see readers actually rendering those images in the margins. So the book presents an intellectual game within the space of a dream where no does not apply. So you have free reign to test your intellectual abilities on the book.
Oh, that's cool. Talk about who wrote it? Where did this come from?
Well, the Hypnerotomachia was published in 1499 by the great printer Aldus Manutius, who created italic type and also created the idea of the book that will fit in your pocket. He was a printer who popularized many classical texts. But this book is something different from his press. It doesn't seem to fit into any existing category, and the author is disputed and unknown.
Oh, wow.
But if you look at the first letter of all 36 chapters and spell out those letters, it forms an acrostic. And the acrostic reads, Frater Franciscus Columna Polion Paramavit, which means Brother Francesco Colonna greatly loved Polia. So it's been argued that the author was a Dominican monk named Francesco Colonna, who sort of sinned his way up the ecclesiastical hierarchy with a relatively scandalous life as a monk, but who became the preacher at St. Mark's in Venice. But there's other arguments for the author. Unfortunately, there's another Francesco Colonna who's also contemporary, who lives in Praeneste, who could also be the candidate. Leon Battista Alberti has been put forward as a candidate. Authorship is disputed.
Okay.
I lean toward it being the Dominican. And the reason is I think that this book is profoundly spiritual. And it relates to Dominican models of prayer, of surrendering to God, of being overwhelmed by emotion in the face of God. And I see traces of Dominican spirituality in the book itself. And that's one of the reasons I think it's the Venetian Colonna. However, part of my project was sort of saying that authorial intent, or even the identity, is an avenue that's already been thoroughly investigated. Let's look at the way people actually use the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And so let's go there. So, one other preface before we go there is you mentioned something that we passed by, but I don't want to, because I think it's an important part of our discussion, which is that it was just recently translated into English in 1999. I mean, here's a 500-year-old book that has been talked to about scholars for, 500. We're working on 550 years soon, and just in 1999 it was translated to English. Which takes me to language as well. So don't let me forget. Yeah. I want to talk about the constructed language, because I think that's an important part of this discussion. But why did it take so long, and how is it being affected? Like your work and other people from the anglicized world, how is it affecting?
One of the reasons the translation, I think, took so long, into modern English. There was a 1592 partial English translation into early modern English, where the translator Robert Dollington gave up about halfway through. But the modern translation was so long in coming, partially because the book has usually been admired more as an art object than as a read text. So bibliographical connoisseurs are interested in the book for its woodcut, for its beauty, for its elegance, but the text has largely been dismissed as unreadable. But one of the things I find is it's eminently readable and fun. It's opulent. It's over the top. It is a great text for reading aloud. And for that reason, the book because it doesn't fit within an existing genre, it's hard to define. So it's hard to find a category of scholarship to apply to it. Do you apply book history approaches? Do you apply Italian studies approaches? And I think Jocelyn Godwin, the translator, who is a great scholar of esotericism, did a great service in making the book a text that is readable, highlighting that this is a novel, not just a visual object for admiration.
And how difficult was it to translate it? Because I've never heard the term constructed language until literally today, just now. So in my mind, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, like most language is done, over time, people talk, and they words evolve over time into different things, and that's how linguists can go back and trace languages back. So a constructed language, I assume, is a language that's the opposite, that like Tolkien created Elvish, or something like that,
like Klingon.
Yeah,
for
Klingon.
example.
Right. So is that what we're talking about when we talk about a constructed language that this was written in?
Pretty close. Constructed languages were a nerdy interest of mine that before I got into the Hypnerotomachia, which drew me in, I was a Tolkien fan and made a half-hearted attempt to learn Sindarin, Elvish. And then as an undergraduate, I learned Esperanto, one of the attempts at a universal language. So I love this idea of looking at language like a toy we can play with, we can manipulate, we can game with. And so when I found that Hypnerotomachia was written in constructed language, that piqued my curiosity. And by constructed, I mean that it takes Latin and Greek etymological roots and combines them in ways that are plausible, but never actually happened in actual speech.
Wow.
Like one example would be saxabondo is one of the words in it, which means abounding in rocks.
Okay.
And so you create these words from compounds that are plausible words that didn't come out in speech. And my doctoral supervisor, Carlo Caruso, argues that this was an attempt to reconstruct what the earliest stages of Romance languages were like, proto-Romance. What was it like when the Romance languages were emerging out of Latin? And this is it. The other idea is that it's a dream. And in a dream, Freud, in the interpretation of dreams, argues that you can combine, dreams are recombinant, like DNA. You can recombine pieces of images, sounds, memories into something entirely new in the dream work. And Giorgio Agamben has argued that that's what the language is, that the language is the language of the dream. That this is, you're getting a view into, to the extent we can, what it would be like to be inside the mind of a Renaissance scholar at night.
That's
who'd
great.
spent their life reading Plutarch, spent their life reading all the Greek and Latin classics, and is dreaming, letting these pieces they've written down in their notebook reinterpret and roll in on themselves and recombine in their minds.
And so how? First of all, what is this? Is the structure then? Like, is it Greek? Is it like how does that work when you're trying to read this thing? Like, yeah, what's the structure of the language? I mean, we have these words, but how are they put together?
They're put together like Italian.
Okay.
So there's not case endings, for example. If you've taken Italian or Latin, it's pretty readable.
Okay.
But part of the game, I suggest, what makes this an activity book is when you come across an unfamiliar word, picking it apart into its pieces.
Right.
Looking at what roots were thrown together to make this word, and how can I deconstruct this word into its components.
Right. And then I would assume then the opposite is true, is once you've deconstructed it and you kind of know what they're getting at, like why did you have to decide why and how it was put together in the way it was, and what that means, because that's a whole other like issue of like, okay, well, why did you do it this way, and why did you use Greek instead of Roman? Like, you could have done it this way, and why did you make those choices? That all, I mean, we do that in English that we know pretty well right now. To do it in a language that has no dictionary, essentially, it's got to be difficult.
Yeah, the language is called Polifilesco, and I think it's quite beautiful. It's overwhelming at first, but the overwhelm quickly turns into it being just this poetry of just rapturous.
So do you read it? Have you read, like, can you, if I were to give you some of this, can you read that and translate that, or is that
with a commentary and a dictionary?
Yeah, I got you.
But a little bit is captured in the translation. The Godwin's translation is effective at rendering the sort of superabundance of the language into English prose.
Very good. Okay. So, I mean, we've talked around this thing for a long time. To talk about it itself, like, I see you brought a copy of the translation there. Like, give us a taste. Like what are we what are we talking about? What's so exciting about this thing?
So let's read the first page of the novel. In this scene, the hero Poliphilo is lamenting his lost beloved Polia, which means many things. And it doesn't mean means many things, but it literally means many things. Polia, Poly. And this is the description of the morning. Phoebus was emerging from the ocean waves at the hour when Leucothea's brow goes bright. The whirling wheels slung beneath his chariot were still out of sight when he appeared dutifully with his flying horses, first Pyrrhus, then Aias, to tint his daughter's pale quadriga with scarlet roses, and to speed after it without delay. His curling hair was already sending its rays scintillating over the restless blue waves. As he arrived at this point, hornless Cynthia was setting opposite, urging on the steeds of her vehicle, which was drawn by a white and dark mule. So you've got this image of the chariot of dawn, but there's at least 4 classical citations in this. And so readers approach this and play the game of thinking, where's that citation come from? Am I erudite enough to get the reference? And in that way, it's quite modern. I mean, a lot of humor today is about, did you get the reference to that show? And that is what we see here. Do I recognize that Pyrrhus and Aeolus are the horses that pull the chariot of the sun? It's like a test for your erudition. Plus, it's just so over the top.
Oh yeah, it is over. I mean, it's very like just, yeah, it is. It's like, okay, so that's a sunset. You know, where do we go from here? Or sunrise. Where do we go from here? You know, that's crazy. Yeah. So let's talk about the story itself. So Polyphia, is that right?
Polyphilo.
Polyphilo. Is the main character.
Yeah.
And is missing, and then is in, and yeah, talk about the story. Let's talk about that.
So it's an encyclopedia framed in a love story, where there's this lover, Polyphilo, he who loves many things, who is seeking after his beloved Polia. And it's sort of like Dante's Beatrice, for example. This image of the idealized beloved who symbolizes that which is holy and true that you see in other Renaissance writings. But he falls asleep in a dream, falls into a sub-dream, and then starts to journey through this fantastical landscape, moving toward Polia, where there are an abundance of structures, gardens, inscriptions, all in ruinous form. So this landscape symbolizes classical antiquity. And Polyphilo symbolizes the love of Renaissance scholars for that antiquity. And as he goes through this landscape, Polyphilo continually gets distracted by the buildings he sees, the gardens with all their scents and sights that entrance him. And he goes off on tangents. He'll say, I must describe this. Like he'll look at a building and describe the building with all the features that you can see from Vitruvius's On Architecture. Then he realizes, I'm getting distracted. I have to go back to this, which is why I think this book is the perfect book for someone with ADD, because it's about a protagonist wrestling with, it's called cupiditas rerum novarum, the love of new things,
right?
The love of novelty. And he's continually pursuing this. Then he gets to Polia, and the narrative reverses. So now Polia is the narrator, and she speaks in a much more prosaic style, and almost sort of like condemning him. Look at this silly boy who's in love with me. And it is interesting that she is a figment within a dream, but she's given an extended voice. And you can argue, is she a figment in Polyphilo's mind, or is she someone with agency in her own right?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about. Like, are all these things that, how do all these things that we love, have become a life of their own, and that kind of idea. This might sound like a silly question, but
are no silly questions.
Okay, so by the way, that takes me to a funny story.
Go for it.
I heard the story of Stephen Meyer. Do you know who he is?
I don't.
He's a scholar who wrote Signature in the Cell, and he works at the Discovery Institute. But he talked about when he was studying at Oxford, and It's one of my favorite stories I've ever heard. And there was a lecturer giving a lecture, and he asked a question, and afterwards his advisor took him aside and said to him something to the effect of, I know in America the saying "there's no such thing as a stupid question" is very popular there. That's not the case here at Oxford.
Oh, I found that at being at a British university.
Yeah, I bet you did.
Yeah.
You better know what you know before you ask me. But the idea of my stupid question is this: like, it's that's such an interesting psychological thing of a dream and then a subdream within the dream. Mm-hmm. It seems, of course, over the top, which this whole thing is, but what is there is there a reason for that? Is there what do scholars talk about the like what's going on in the dream itself that is there's a need for a subdream?
One of the scholars who was really drawn to the Hypnerotomachia was Carl Jung.
Okay.
Who talked about the dream space as a fusing recombinant space akin to the alchemical process. So the way we form dreams is similar to the way gold is synthesized from lead. And why it's necessary to have an Inception-style sub-dream isn't something I'd reflected a lot about, but I think it might be necessary to get that deep into the dream work in order to be able to have no barriers. A scholar named, her name escapes me right now, argued that this book is a liberatory space where everything that a Renaissance scholar is expected to know is fused and melded back on itself and combined and recombined. And it might be necessary to be in a subdream to get to that kind of liberation from constraint.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah.
Leanne Lefebvre was the scholar who argued that. It just came to mind.
Okay. So that's actually pretty fascinating that you'd have to get to a place where not only are there no limitations, but the limitation, but the substance themselves or the ideas themselves have no limitations. Like that's an interesting concept, which is very Inception-like.
It's kind of like the modern idea of brainstorming, of generating ideas. And what I argue is that this book was used as a tool for two steps in the rhetorical process. Inventio, for the cultivation of ingenio. And what that means is Quintilian and Cicero, Quintilian in his In Studio Oratoria, Cicero in his book De Topica, say that the first step of composing anything, a speech, but any artistic work at all, is generating ideas. Mm-hmm. How do you come up with anything new to say? And so the process is called inventio, or is to bring together different existing components to create something new out of pre-existing pieces.
Which is why you need an invented language. I mean,
yeah.
It really does fall like right into like it's almost the perfect thing that it had to be a constructed language because it had to come from these pieces and parts that were already like. I mean, that's a fascinating idea because, as a musician, and anybody who does anything creative or anything, like you said, to do something new, like there's no such thing as something new.
Yeah.
Everything, what's new is actually something that's been reconstructed or has been looked at in a different way. And to come up with something, actually inventive and new, there's very little of that,
Yeah, and the ability to do that to come up with something fresh from existing components in the Renaissance was known as ingenio.
Okay.
Or in the same root as ingenious.
Ingenious, yeah.
Or the way ingenio was often translated into English was witty. And your wit or your ingenio was understood to be a faculty you could cultivate. And what I argue is that in this book, the games people play with the text are intended to sharpen the saw. They're intended to refine your ingenio so you make more effective inventio.
Right. Okay. So let's go to that. Like we've talked about a little bit why you have such a passion for this text, and it's clear why you do. But and we talked about why you decided to study the margins. What maybe give us a taste of some of the fascinating things that you found, not by the text but by the margins themselves, that really you went, oh my gosh, that's insane. Like, because that's where new stuff can come from, where you're like, oh, I would have never thought of that.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that aspect of that discovery that you went through as you studied the margins.
Sure, I can highlight a few annotators and the way they created something new. One of the annotators was Ben Jonson, a playwright contemporary of Shakespeare, who read a copy of the later edition, the 1545 edition that's in the British Library. And each annotator, amidst all this overabundance of material, has to choose their own adventure. In a sense, pick what the analogy I use is it's like walking down a museum and there's side aisles. What side aisles do I want to go down? When do I want to stay on the central pattern of the narrative? And Ben Jonson specifically highlights those features that are representable on stage. He's interested in chariots. He's interested in buildings. And Ben Jonson collaborated with his friend and later rival Inigo Jones in making elaborate stage designs for his plays. And my argument is that he is using this text for inventio. He's using it to come up with new ideas to put into his plays and masks. Another annotator we see doing some pretty fun stuff is Pope Alexander VII in a copy in the Vatican Library, which I had the privilege to see in person.
Oh, wow.
And he reads the text as a rhetorical treatise. So he's interested in looking at the text for when the author uses certain rhetorical devices. But Alexander VII also liked to go on sedan chair rides around the Baroque Rome. He is largely the builder of Baroque Rome. And the case in the thesis I make in the thesis is that he saw his journey through the fictional space of the Hypnerotomachia in a manner similar to his journeys through the actual space of Baroque Rome. Oh, wow. So as he wandered around Rome looking at structures and buildings, Poliphilo did the same.
Because you're talking about like Baroqueness, which again, makes you think of things over the top and crazy, architecture and stuff. What was it? Maybe if not inspired, did this text affect actual architecture and things like that?
It did. There's a garden called Bomarzo in Italy, which has all these fantastic structures that are argued to be inspired by the HP, as I call it for short, spare the pronunciation.
Yeah.
Versailles has some features based on the Hypnerotomachia. The painter Lesueur illustrated some scenes from the Hypnerotomachia. So it had quite an extended reception, especially in the 19th century. A lot of these arts and crafts movement woodcut artists like Aubrey Beardsley drew on the Hypnerotomachia as well. And the book seems to have had a wide readership. One piece of evidence for that is there's a book called The Courtier by Castiglione, which is basically a guide to how to be a Renaissance gentleman, how to be a courtier. And one of the phrases he says is, when you speak with women, don't woo them like Poliphilo does with excessive affluent language. And the fact that he, in a popular book like for a broad audience, Castiglione would reference Poliphilo shows that it has an extensive reception. It wasn't an unread book.
Which goes back to, something we talked about earlier. Like it's almost shocking to me that a proper modern English translation wasn't done until almost the 21st century.
Yeah.
And you kind of explained why, but to me, again, that's still kind of shocking. Like, and I get it. Like, English isn't the end all be all. In other words, there's plenty of scholars that are happy to learn Italian and happy to do what it takes to do this. But it's just it just surprised. I guess the biggest surprise to me is I find English to be the most universal of languages, not just because I'm an American, but because it is so easy. Like, for example, how easy is it to turn Google into a verb? Like that.
Yes.
It happened like that. It is, and I know when English was starting to come of age, that it was like a literal new technology, that people were using this to be able to communicate in new and strange ways that were easily done in English that couldn't be done in other languages. So it's kind of shocking to me that it took so long to get a good English translation.
Especially because since you see attempts in early modern English to copy the Poliphilesque style. Another near contemporary of Shakespeare was John Lilly, the playwright, who wrote in a style called euphuism. And euphuism is elaborate, florid, excessive language. And what I think is that euphuism in part is trying to take the Poliphilesque mode and bring it into English. Yeah.
Interesting. So we've talked about this as kind of a game, which I love that idea, and as a test. All of these things I can absolutely see. Was the text, or are the people that are playing the game, are they trying to get to the bottom of something, or are they playing the game and then coming up with ideas and kind of going on that way? In other words, is there a root to this thing that people are trying to get to?
Well, there was a novel written about this.
Okay.
The novel is called The Rule of Four. Came out in 2006 by Ian Caldwell and Dustin Thomason, who took as their concept for the novel that there's a code behind the Hypnerotomachia.
Okay, right on.
And the code, not to spoil the novel, has to deal with Savonarola burning the books in the bonfires of the vanities,
okay,
and trying to save the legacy of antiquity. I'm not convinced, though there isn't the acrostic of the first 36 chapters, which is wild enough. I don't think there's one unified code, or I don't think that there's a key to crack this text. I think it's much too excessive for that. It overflows any boundary we put on it.
Because it is, in other words, it is an encyclopedia. In other words, it's not trying to go deep into something. It's trying to say, how can all of these parts be used together? And I use superficially, very that's not the best word to use, but it is like, it seems to me as you're describing it, like to be, how much do you know, and how can you work intellectually with all these component pieces?
Doing this becomes your own refinement of your own ingenio.
Oh, that's good.
Because you're trying to cope with excess. The word that's used is copia. Cope with there being just too much to handle. And that stretches you. I think I grew a lot in studying this book. One of the points you mentioned earlier about is there a subcode? Is there a bottom to this? There certainly was the idea in the 17th century that there was, because there were alchemical readers of the text who read the book as an allegory of the alchemical great work, and viewed the text as allegorizing some kind of alchemical process.
Okay.
Now, whether or not that was Colonna's intent is questionable, but it's certainly the way some early annotators, including the one in the Buffalo Library, saw the text as allegorizing the great work, because there was this idea in the Renaissance called the Prisca Sapientia, which is the ancient wisdom, that there is a deep ancient core of wisdom that has been transmitted from age to age. And the representative text for that is the Emerald Tablet, which was translated by Isaac Newton, which is thought to allegorize alchemy. And the idea was the more complex, the more unreadable it is, the more ancient it is, therefore the more accurate it is.
Yeah. That seems to be the case for a lot of those esoteric folk.
Yeah.
That it's got to be like it's very Gnostic in that way.
Yes.
Where it's this hidden knowledge that will if not save you, it will at least bring you gold. That's interesting. That's wild. Maybe let's go there for a second, just because it's fun and
Sure.
who doesn't love good cults and good esotericism? Like, who are some of the groups that you love? The Illuminati, you love group. Those are just such fun groups to talk about. But how did some of these groups view this text, if at all? And and go there for a second.
One distant connection between esotericism, but it's a line you can trace, is with Aleister Crowley, who created a religion called Thelema, which means will. And he got that phrase from Rabelais, who in Gargantua and Pantagruel created an abbey of Thelem. But Rabelais got the word Thelema, will, from the Hypnerotomachia, which has a nymph called Thelema. There's two nymphs, Thelema and Logistica, logic or reason, who lead on Polyphilo.
Oh, that's so cool.
But he has to learn to stop listening to Logistica and start listening to love. So there's this argument to convert yourself over to love. So I just think that it's interesting how Crowley was able to take that word Thelem and move it on forward.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. By the way, this is my ADD talking right now.
That's okay.
Because like you'd say one thing, I'm like, zing, squirrel. We haven't even touched like all the characters, and I'm sure that we can't touch all the characters. But talk about talk about the characters. Who are they, and who do we see? So that are engaging with Polyphia.
Well, one of the things that's neat about the book is that there's relatively few characters.
Okay.
Polyphilo and Polia are well developed, but everyone else is like an NPC, is like a set piece. There are a number of nymphs who he encounters who both tempt Polyphilo away from Polia or lead him on towards her. There's one great scene where they meet Queen Eleuterilida, which means Queen Free Will, and have a dialogue with her on the nature of free will and should we submit ourselves to love, which is one of the reasons I think the book is Dominican, because there's this constant in Dominican spirituality of giving yourself over to love. But the world he travels through is a very empty one. It's a world of ruins, a world of lamentation for what antiquity was, and with the hope that we can recover it and the knowledge that we can't.
So like it's almost like a post-apocryphal, like if we were to watch like some movie that took place in 3200, but it was maybe like Anthem or something like that, where it's post-nuclear Holocaust and we're walking through this. That's the kind of feeling that you get as you read through this. It's very like crumbled, a society that has crumbled and died.
I really appreciate that post-apocalyptic. I never thought of it that way, but it really is. It works quite well as an analogy, because he's moving through the ruins of a world that the Renaissance humanists wanted to restore, but know and to some degree is unrecoverable. And that sense of vastness and loss is kind of what I think that Pope Alexander VII did in his copy in the Vatican Library. Because as he's traveling through Rome on his sedan chair, viewing the ruins of antiquity, he's having that experience like Polyphilo. He's like seeing this lost world, but trying to restore it as he can. Like one of the things that Pope Alexander VII liked to do was collect obelisks from Egypt and set them up in Rome. So you get that sense of the restoration of antiquity as well to the greatest extent possible. But the Renaissance humanists were the ones who coined the phrase Dark Age. And the phrase, the whole concept of the Dark Ages is moving out of scholarship. People tend to say early Middle Ages now because there's even a book called The Bright Ages about how much intellectual activity there was in the so-called Dark Ages. But the Renaissance humanists saw the fall of Rome as entering a period of bleakness for which they were the restorers. And when I say humanist, I mean a scholar of the humanities. Humanist in this concept hasn't taken on the secular connotations it has today.
Gotcha. Okay. And by the way, that kind of, I was thinking about this before, but you have this book that was probably written by a monk or somebody within the priesthood. You have in a time that was, very religious at a but at the same time was restoring, as you mentioned before, like these pagan ideals and these kind of old classical ideas. Where does God, if at all, play a role in this text, or have people tried to work him in there somewhere?
God, as in Yahweh, does not appear in the book anywhere. Jupiter is figured prominently.
Okay.
And Jupiter, who is often called Dispater, the father of the gods or the father of day, depending on how you want to render it, and you see annotators rendering it both ways, figures prominently in the book. But you do see a lot of theology, especially sort of Aristotelian Thomistic theology, in the vein of Thomas Aquinas. Like there's one monument he comes to which shows the models of the irascible soul, the concupiscent soul, and the rational soul. So the author of this is familiar with theology. He also adopts modes of prayer which are very, in a sense, self-surrendering. And another feature is that the author of this book loves liturgical equipment, like you'd see in a Catholic church, chalices, candelabras, tabernacles. There's one instance where he basically comes upon a group of nuns of Venus and describes their church, but whoever did this knows Catholic liturgical accoutrements very well.
Yeah.
So that's why I think that this is a work of Christian humanism, but there's also an Islamic influence. There is Arabic text in the book, and there's one scene where the nuns of Venus are bent over in prayer in a manner that looks like Islamic genuflecting.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Okay. Is the same person that wrote the text the same person that did the wood carvings?
No, but they were working closely together.
Okay.
The woodcut artist is unknown. It's been argued it was Mantegna, but it's as yet unknown. We don't know who did the typeset. It was Francesco Griffo. And that typeset that you see in the book is the model for the Polyphilus font in Adobe PageMaker. If you remember that?
Yes.
And the Bembo font both come from the HP. But I do think that the interaction of word and image is so close that the author had to be alive to see it through the press without this. Part of the argument of Léon Lefebvre is that the author was Léon Battista Alberti, who great Renaissance architect and scholar who died 17 years before it was published. So I don't think this book was done posthumously.
Yeah.
I really think that Colonna and Aldus Manutius were working closely together in making this happen.
Interesting. Man, I feel like I'm at kind of a point where like I don't know what I don't know.
Yeah.
So I want to finish with this and then maybe add some more added things if you'd like, but how does it end? Does he just wake up and like, hey, we're back? Like,
he wakes up after the dream. Poliphilus encounters Polia in Cythera, the realm of Venus. They have this reunion, kind of like Dante reuniting with Beatrice, and then he wakes up.
oh wow,
And he wakes up and it says, "Flor sic execatus nunquam reviviscit." A flower thus dried up will never be revived. And it ends on that sad note. And it ends in 1467, which might be the date that the actual girl who's thought to have inspired Polia died.
Wow,
Yeah.
That's interesting. Which it just actually made me think of another thing, like, because we talk like, when I did my interview with Michael Ward about C.S. Lewis and his great book, which is the Planet Narnia.
Yeah.
I didn't realize how influential the planets were to the medieval mind. And does that go back to because that's also something that fascinated the classicist, or is that relatively unique how much that the planets and the idea that they affected us and that they played a role in our lives? How much does that affect both in the book but also to like kind of a medieval scholar or a medieval person of the day?
There is a diagram of the planets in this.
No way. Of course there is. There has to be.
I'm trying to find it right now, but I think if I remember correctly, it's in the Nunnery of Venus.
Okay.
Where the diagram of the planets exists. So I don't know to what extent there's an astrological influence. It's not something I've looked into in depth, but it would be a really cool avenue for investigation. One thing that I wanted to be sure to mention before we go, because you're a musician, is this book is fascinated with musical modes. It will describe, always say, when you come across the nymph singing a piece of music, he'll always say it's mixolydian.
Oh, that's awesome.
Or it's Lydian. And there's an association in the Renaissance mind with emotions associated with given modes.
Right.
The idea that some modes could even drive you mad.
Yeah.
And that is part of the argument of giving yourself over to love.
That's very interesting. Okay, yeah. I mean, sold. No, that's pretty cool because that does that idea does translate so clearly even to today. We don't really talk, in fact, we do actually more talk about the church modes more and more these days, especially because of jazz music, because they use it quite a bit. But the idea that it gives you a certain feeling, that it gives a certain idea, you even see that like in how pianos were tuned, in the early and mid 19th century. There's a reason why Chopin used B minor for his funeral march.
Yeah, certainly.
And it's hard to recreate that on a modern piano. And not that we should necessarily, but it's interesting. Like all of these things play a role. So that's fascinating. That is prominent in this book.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. Well, Dr. Russell, James, my friend, thanks for coming back.
My pleasure.
We got to do it again. Like I feel like now I have enough to I can engage a little bit and maybe have some additional questions and some more dialogue. I'd love to
be glad to,
because I know we haven't even touched the surface.
Yeah, if you are a student looking for something new to study, consider the Hypnerotomachia Poliphili. This surface has barely been scratched. There's so much more to be done on this book.
By the way, having said that, and I know that you said that's true, and I know it's true, but like we have all these scholars that have studied it to a certain degree anciently, but then did that just fall out of favor? Did it get lost? Like how did it become now? And yeah, talk about why didn't the scholarship just continue on?
One of the problems is the 19th century idea of book collecting, where 19th century collectors valued pristine copies. And they would see marginal notes as vandalism. Whereas now we see them as abundant evidence for reader networks and reader interaction, and that could have led to copies being lost or washed or otherwise clipped.
And this book is meant to be marginalized, and it's meant to have.
It invites the reader to do so. It has, in the imperative mood, gives instructions. Draw this.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's cool. That actually made me think of one other thing. If you're reading a I don't know, whatever edition of it that you happen to have, would that get passed down? So, for example, would you be reading a book and you're seeing these notes, and maybe you think it's one scholar, but maybe it's somebody else? Like, how often does that happen that you have to translate because the edition has been passed down from one person to another?
There are a few modern editions to compare. One by Pozzi and Chiapponi, one by Ariani and Gabriele. So I would look at the 1964 edition, the 1980 edition, and then Jocelyn Godwin's 1999 edition, and compare between them. And then treat the early modern annotators as almost like a fourth set. So to put them all in conversation with each other.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, man, let's do this again.
I like that.
Let's do it again. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. James Russell. Oh, if people want to find out more what you're doing, like, do you have any projects? Is there anything that you're working on, in the next 10 years?
Sure. You can Google James Russell Hypnerotomachia. I'm sure the spelling will be in the show notes to find my PhD thesis. I'm on the social network Mastodon at Dr. James Russell. And I'm working on turning my doctoral thesis into a book. So I'll let you know when that book contract becomes solid.
That sounds good, man. That would be great. Thanks for being on. We'll do it again.
Sounds good.
Mike is gone.
You are listening to And If Love Remains.
Gone but not forgotten.
First of 23 installments requested by Dr. Levitt. Trying to be in compliance here because we're taking him and that whole organization